Welcome everyone, my name is Steve McIntosh and I am one of the Regional Chief Information Security Officers in the HEFESTIS CISO Share Service. Along with my colleague James Knock from the HEFESTIS Data Protection Office Share, we are going to take a look at supplier security. We will look at the Scottish Government's guidance for public sector suppliers. The HEFE sector is very much a part of the supply chain and in some cases as both a supplier and a customer. This, as you will see, will lead us on to then look at the National Cyber Security Centre's 12 Principles of Supply Chain Security. Some really useful general advice, again, for the whole organisation. I will then pass over to James to talk about the threat of legal action and the need for supplier due diligence. The guidance published by the Scottish Government has been done so with the following aims: to support organisations to put in place consistent, proportionate, risk-based policies that effectively reduce the risk of damage or disruption by supplier cybersecurity issues, to minimise any necessary additional burdens on organisations as purchasers and private and third sector organisations as suppliers, whilst ensuring the presence of proportionate cybersecurity controls in the public sector supply chain, and to ensure alignment with key requirements in respect of supply chain security. The guidance published by the Scottish Government has been done so with the following aims: to support organisations to put in place consistent, proportionate, risk-based policies that effectively reduce the risk of damage or disruption by supplier cybersecurity issues, to minimise any necessary additional burdens on organisations as purchasers and private and third sector organisations as suppliers, whilst ensuring the presence of proportionate cybersecurity controls in the public sector supply chain, and to ensure alignment with key requirements in respect of supply chain security. The guidance has been split up into 4 key points. The first key point is the adoption of the National Cyber Security Centre's supply chain principles, and we're going to have a closer look at those next. The second key point is an alignment of minimum security requirements. Again, part of the NCSC's principles that we're going to look at. The third key point is to implement the principles through an information cyber assurance process. So making sure that we embed them in our procurement processes, which can be used to help assess levels of cyber risk when procuring. It can be a questionnaire, such as our cloud risk questionnaire that we'll look at, or some other method to support your decision making. And the final key point 4 is the proportionate use of certification and accreditation. Proportionate being the key word here. It may be that our information cyber assurance process indicates that accreditations and certifications such as Cyber Essentials or ISO 27001, to cover both ends of the spectrum, may be appropriate to provide additional insurance. The need for these should be judged on a case-by-case basis, and understanding the scope and the expiry date of any certification is important. So let's look at key point 1 in a bit more depth, which means looking at the NCSC's 12 principles of supply chain security. Now, these 12 principles have been divided into 4 separate stages. The first stage, understanding the risks, has the first 3 principles and really deals with the information gathering stage. This second stage, establish control, contains the principles that will help you gain and maintain control of your supply chain. The third stage, check your arrangements. Your organisation will need to gain confidence in their approach for establishing control over the supply chain, and the principle in this section will help you to do that. And the final stage, stage 4, continuous improvement. As your supply chain evolves, you'll need to continue improving and maintaining security to keep up to speed with all the changes, and the principles within the stage will help you to do that. The first stage is all about understanding the risks. Until you have a clear picture of your supply chain, it will be very hard to establish any meaningful control over it. You will need to invest an appropriate amount of effort and resource into achieving this. So principle one, understand what needs to be protected and why. Think about the level of protection you need suppliers to give to your assets, to your information, as well as the products and services they will deliver to you as part of any contract. Two, know who your suppliers are and build an understanding of what their security looks like. Also think about subcontractor security and get information from your supplier about any further arrangements that they will have put in place around accessing your information assets. Remember, we are only interested in the parts of the supplier's business or the systems that are used to handle our information or the services we are using, so we can focus on that and not the entire supplier's business. Three, understand the security risk posed by your supply chain. Assess the risks these arrangements pose to your information assets and services used, and also to the wider supply chain. Again, we can group similar risk profiles together, such as high, medium, low, to make responses more consistent. We can also let suppliers know of our risk classification decisions and how that affects our engagement with them. The second stage is establishing control. These principles can help us gain more control of our supply chain, which allows us to analyze strategic risks to it. For example, we can identify any suppliers who fail to meet security and performance expectations, and we can identify our critical assets, and any over-reliance on a single supplier can further help to build diversity and redundancy into our planning. So we start off with principle 4 here. Communicate your view of security needs to your suppliers. So ensuring that our suppliers understand and adhere to their responsibilities include security requirements in any subcontracts that they may have with the other suppliers. 5, set and communicate minimum security requirements for your suppliers. Now, this is also key point 2 in the Scottish Government's guidance, and these should be justified, proportionate, and achievable. Considering setting different protection levels based on the risk associated with them, include your minimum security requirements in the contracts as well. Have a look at the use cases provided by the NCSC. Now, these use cases, which are case studies, provide examples of how the principles can be applied in practical supply chain scenarios. Principle 6, build security considerations into your normal contracting processes. This will help you to manage security throughout the lifetime of the contract, including the termination phase and the transfer of information and services to another supplier. 7, meet your own security responsibilities as a supplier and consumer. Ensure you enforce and meet any requirements on you as a supplier and of course as a customer of services. 8, raise awareness of security within your supply chain. Explain security risks to your suppliers. Promote and adopt the sharing of security information right across the supply chain to enable better understanding and anticipation of emerging security attacks. 9, provide support for security incidents. We should all be prepared to provide support and assistance if necessary where security incidents have a potential to impact us or the wider supply chain. And of course, it's always nice to share lessons learned with others. We all need to ensure that we have confidence in establishing control over the supply chain. And stage 3, check your arrangement, only has one principle. Principle 10, build assurance activities into your supply chain management. This is commonly done through contracts. You may wish to have contract clauses that require upward reporting of security performance and adherence to risk management policies and processes. You may want to build the right to audit into all contracts as well. You could talk to your suppliers about assurances such as cyber essentials, penetration testing, or some other security certification that you may have as a requirement. Other things that you might want to consider are the establishment of key performance indicators for supplier security management practices, encouraging suppliers to promote good security behaviours, and reviewing and acting on any lessons learned. As your supply chain evolves, you'll need to continue improving and maintaining security. And this brings us to the final stage, continuous improvement, where there are the remaining two principles. Principle 11, encourage the continuous improvement of security within your supply chain. You can do this by emphasizing how this might enable them to compete for and maybe even win future contracts with you. You can advise and support your suppliers as they make improvements, and don't put up unnecessary barriers. If they have something equivalent to what you need, don't make them get the exact control just so you can tick a box. Try and be flexible in your treatment of what is already there. You can give them time to achieve security improvements, but ask for timescales and plans, and act on anything that points to things not working quite right, such as security incidents or anything in upward reports, etc. Principle 12, build trust with suppliers. Build strategic partnerships with key suppliers, sharing issues with them, encouraging and valuing their input. Gain their buy-in to your approach to supply chain security so that it takes account of their needs as well as your own. And let them manage subcontractors for you, but require them to provide you with appropriate reporting to confirm the status of these relationships, and maintain continuous and effective communication with your suppliers. Really approach supply chain management as a shared issue. A quick overview of the benefits of one of the tools available to our members, the HEFESTIS Cloud Risk Questionnaire. Now, this tool can be used for discovering and assessing the risks associated with externally hosted cloud services. The tool works best with early engagement with the procurement process, and it works by assigning a score to a set of questions. The score represents the risk level, so the higher the score, the greater the risk. The benefits, as you can see on the screen here, are that it provides a fairly quick and simple assessment of the risks. It provides openness and transparency about the service. You can compare suppliers or solutions against each other. And the risk of the business owner has more information to make a more informed decision. And the supplier fills in the form and you assign the scores. So they do most of the work. It creates and allows for a deeper dialogue with the cloud supplier as well. But for now, I'll pass over to James to look at the legal ramifications and the need for supplier due diligence.
As soon as you involve personal data in your systems, the risks go up considerably. This is because you have to abide by data protection law and protect individuals and their personal data, and because your responsibilities don't just stop with your organization. If you're using a vendor or a supplier or their systems to process personal data for which you are a data controller, you're still responsible. Indeed, the ICO says that you are also responsible for the compliance of your processes. So it's important to make sure you've checked your processes and vendors. Some of the risks that can come when you use personal data are regulatory fines up to 17 or 18 million pounds, compensation for data subjects in the event of an incident perhaps, and legal and cleanup fees in the event of an incident, and litigation should also be considered. Individuals have the right to seek compensation when their data protection rights aren't upheld, for example in the case of a data breach. It's important to note that data subjects have the right to ask another organisation to take forward claims on their behalf. This opens the door for law firms, for example, to take forward class action lawsuits in the American style. Here we see British Airways settling a data breach compensation claim with 16,000 individuals affected. How many customers or service users have you got, and how quickly might things get out of hand if you're paying each of those compensation? When engaging with suppliers for products or services that involve personal data processing, for which you're the controller, it's very important to familiarise yourself with Article 82 of the UK GDPR. This says that where parties are responsible for damage, each controller or processor shall be held liable for the entire damage. This means that if one party is partly responsible and the other party partly responsible, each party could be held to pay out all of the compensation and then, for example, claim the other part back. Here we can see an example of the Blackboard data breach that affected many universities. They were the supplier. And then we see on the right a real Facebook advert targeted to ex-students of one of those universities saying, come and join our compensation claim. So it's not always the case that individuals have to be proactive and knowledgeable about their rights to take these things forward, or indeed have a lot of money. Rather, it is the new normal that law firms would seek to find litigants and to take cases forward. So this is a considerable risk in addition to regulatory fines, and one that is not avoided by employing suppliers and services, and indeed might be made larger by employing those services. So then, whenever you engage a supplier who will be processing personal data for you, and they're a processor, you will only use suppliers providing sufficient guarantees to get things right from a data protection point of view. The trouble, of course, is that you cannot always rely on what you read on the internet, and suppliers in many cases will have a very large incentive to tell you what you'd like to hear, and may publish grand claims on their websites that they are 100% compliant or impossible to hack or any of the above. We shouldn't just rely on this, and we should do good due diligence checks. But how much due diligence is enough due diligence? Well, the recent Ticketmaster decision notice shows us that the ICO expects organisations to undertake a good level of due diligence, and I've included my thoughts on that decision notice and what it tells us in the coming slides. In the Ticketmaster case, Ticketmaster employed Inventor to provide a chatbot that was used on the Ticketmaster website. The attackers got into the chatbot, inserted malicious code, and from there were able to scrape personal data from the Ticketmaster website. So here you can see an organization and their supplier and the interplay where attacks and incidents occur with the supplier that then affect the other company. My first thought reading the notice is that the ICO expects organizations to do their checks before procuring the product and embedding the product, and over time, once the product has started being used and embedded in your services. Here we can see that the ICO set out that no adequate security testing was carried out specific to the interaction between the third-party application and the payment page on the website. So this is saying you shouldn't just do a check of the supplier, rather you should do a check of what you're wanting to do with the supplier's software or systems and how it interacts with your systems and products, because that can be where the risk arises. My next thought is that the ICO is saying you shouldn't just do your checks up front. You should check over time to make sure that the supplier hasn't dropped below the expected standard and is doing things in the right way. Indeed, here we see that the ICO comment that the Ticketmaster did not review the code when it changed. So we should make sure we have proportionate steps to keep things consistent and keep things checked along the way. In many cases, when undertaking due diligence, the first thing that many organizations will reach for is ISO standards and other certifications. However, organizations should avoid using these standards as a shortcut to undertaking due diligence. We see in the ICO's decision notice a telling phrase that the Commissioner places little weight on the mere provision of such certifications as a mechanism of securing the chatbot in the circumstances. So organizations should only rely on certifications where they are specific to the exact product or service being purchased, and only rely on them to a reasonable extent, and always undertake all other relevant due diligence checks. They should not be relied on alone as a simple, right, they have this certification, that's due diligence complete. That's not going to be enough. Organizations should avoid reliance on contract terms as protective measures. Just because a supplier says in a contract that they will not be hacked, that doesn't actually protect them, of course, from being hacked. So you should always make sure that wherever you have contract terms around keeping data secure or making sure that security measures are up to place, those contract terms are backed up with good evidence that the organization has good measures to protect themselves and your data. Indeed, that's what good due diligence is. If you're using an off-the-shelf product from a supplier that you're going to process personal data in, consider how your deployment of that product might increase the risks. In this case, Ticketmaster used the product on their payments page, and the ICO basically says, well, you didn't risk assess the specific use of it on the payments page. Perhaps it would have been appropriate elsewhere, but because the payment page was more problematic, higher risk, you should have done a specific risk assessment for that. So how products and services are deployed by a purchaser and deployed in terms of personal data processing is up to the controller or the purchaser. So you should make sure that you look out for and account for any risks associated with the way in which you're going to use it. That includes any high risk processing you're going to undertake. That includes integration with other services or other systems, and make sure that those interaction factors are accounted for when you do your due diligence and your risk assessments. Don't just look at the product in isolation, look at it and how it will be used and the context in which it will be used, and do your due diligence and assessments on that specifically to protect yourself in all circumstances. So what can you do? Undertake high quality due diligence assessments, wide ranging, detailed. Make these a condition of employing suppliers or other third parties. Don't just employ them because they're cheap. That might come back to cost you more in the long run. Build these checks into your procurement process and your contract approval processes, and budget for them in terms of both time and money. One way you can reduce this burden is by defining preset minimum security standards for different risk levels. This can save you time. You just assess the supplier against your low, medium and high risk security standards that you've set. Be careful of limited liability clauses in contracts. They might interfere with your ability to recoup compensation you've had to pay out under Article 82, when the other person in the agreement should be paying some of that for themselves. Use your DPOs and your CISOs and their resources. And HEFESTIS has pre-written exemplar check documents that they can give to you, and also has a lot more information about the Ticketmaster case and more detailed information on what it says, what it sets out, and more detailed advice on additional due diligence checks you can take and ways you can monitor due diligence over time once a contract has begun.
Thank you, James. Now, James and I are very happy to try and attempt to answer any questions that you may have in regards to the information contained within this presentation. Thank you.